I always thought we were a stable family, nothing particularly glamorous, but solid. Emily and I met in college, during a time when everything felt wide open, and I was sure that, together, we could build a life worth loving. We spent years creating that life, with the usual milestones of marriage, buying our first home, having kids, and for a while, it was good. I had what I thought was the formula for happiness. But somewhere along the way, something began to shift. At first, it was so subtle that I didn't even realize it. Emily would grow quiet during dinner, her eyes distant. She'd sigh heavily when I asked her how her day had gone, like she couldn't quite find the words. I chalked it up to stress. After all, we were both working full-time, managing 2 kids, and trying to maintain the house and our social life. Stress was just part of the package. But looking back, I think there was more to it. Her moments of silence, the sighs, the way she'd leave the room sometimes after the kids had gone to bed. It was all their small clues that I wrapped in the routine of our lives. Didn't fully see. As the weeks went on, I noticed other changes too. Emily took up new hobbies, which I supported, thinking it was healthy for her to have something outside of work and family. But these hobbies quickly took on a life of their own. She started going to weekend retreats, yoga workshops, painting classes, things I'd never seen her express interest in before. I figured she was exploring, maybe even going through some midlife rediscovery. I thought it was harmless. How naive I was. Then one evening, when the kids were asleep, Emily sat across from me, her face drawn and serious. She said we needed to talk. There's something missing in my life, she began, her voice barely a whisper. I felt my stomach drop as she looked me in the eye and said she needed time away to find herself, to figure out who she was beyond being a wife and mother. It sounded almost rehearsed, as if she'd practiced this speech for days. I stared at her, unable to fully process her words. How do you respond when the person you've shared your life with suddenly announces she's leaving? Not out of hatred or anger, but because she's lost. I wanted to ask her how she could feel lost in a life we had built together. But the words caught in my throat. I need you to understand, she said, reaching for my hand. I couldn't find the strength to pull away, but her touch felt foreign. I managed to nod, though I didn't understand, not at all. I spent most of that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the words she'd said, the way she looked at me, almost pleading for my understanding. Find herself, what did that even mean? I'd read about people in midlife, finding themselves. But it was always something that happened to other families, other couples. Those stories seemed like cautionary tales, not something that would come crashing into my living room, fracturing the life we'd built together. The next morning, the sun rose like any other day, golden light spilling over our bedroom. But the warmth in the house was gone. Emily moved quietly, as if she were a ghost in our home, speaking in hushed tones and skirting around me like I was a stranger. She'd already packed a suitcase and was saying goodbye to Sarah and Ethan, speaking in soft reassurances as they clung to her legs. I'll see you soon, she murmured, promising them phone calls and telling them to listen to Daddy. They were too young to understand what this was, too young to know what it meant when a mother walked out to rediscover herself. It was too surreal to be angry at that moment. I stood there, feeling more hollow than anything, almost floating above myself as I watched her step out the door, suitcase in hand, without a backward glance. And just like that, she was gone. The first week without her was nothing short of chaos. I'd always been a hands-on father, but being the only adult in charge, responsible for every tear, every scraped knee, every school pickup, it felt like I was running a marathon I hadn't trained for. The mornings were the hardest. Without Emily there, the house felt emptier, quieter, like a theater stage before the actors arrive. Sarah, our eldest, took to asking about her mom with relentless curiosity. Almost every morning, is Mommy coming home today? She'd look at me with such a hopeful face that I had to lie, telling her Mommy was just away for a little while. But my words felt hollow. Every time I saw her expression falter, my heart fractured a little more, until I wasn't sure how many more of those questions I could take. One night, after I'd put him to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the silence pressing down on me. I scrolled through my phone, wondering if I should text her, ask her when she was coming back, or if she was coming back at all. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was anger, or maybe I was afraid of the answer. Days blended into one another. There was laundry, grocery shopping, work calls, and after-school snacks. I threw myself into keeping a routine, partly for the kids, partly for myself. Structure, I thought, might be the only thing keeping us together. But as each day passed, I felt like I was unraveling, like I was becoming a hollow version of myself. It was hard to shake the feeling that I'd been left behind, abandoned in a life I no longer knew how to live. About a month after she left, I got a text from her. One of those chirpy, breezy messages as if we were old friends catching up. She was in California, apparently, and had taken up painting. She said she felt alive in ways she hadn't felt in years. She mentioned the ocean, the sunsets, and a newfound sense of freedom. She even sent a photo, her face lit by the glow of the setting sun, looking every bit like the free spirit she claimed to have become. There was a strange kind of irony in the way she seemed to expect that I'd be waiting. Somehow paused, living the life she'd left. I could almost hear her saying, "You'll understand one day," as if she were on some grand journey that would eventually make sense to me, too. But I couldn't see the allure of her new life. All I saw was what she'd abandoned, what she'd left behind for me to hold together. I was the one who sat with Sarah as she struggled with her homework. The one who cleaned up Ethan's messes. The one who stayed awake with worry each night. There was no freedom in this. There was only the aching reality of every choice she'd made. And I was the one carrying the weight of it. People in town knew what had happened, though I didn't have to say anything. Our community was small, and rumors traveled faster than truths. Neighbors would stop by, offering casseroles and polite smiles. They'd linger just long enough to ask how I was doing, to give me that look of pity that grated on my nerves. Some tried to reassure me, saying things like, "Oh, she'll come back eventually." Others hinted at frustration, saying how they couldn't understand how a mother could just up and leave her kids like that. The truth was, I didn't understand either. I didn't know how to reconcile the woman I'd loved with the stranger she'd become. And so, I did my best to keep my head down, to nod politely, and to dodge the neighbors' questions as much as I could. In a way, their sympathy felt like a weight pressing down on me, reminding me of everything that was out of my control. It was hard to explain, even to myself, the tangled mess of emotions I felt. There were moments I missed her terribly. Times I wanted nothing more than to see her walk through the door and tell me it was all a mistake. But then there were other moments, darker ones, when the anger flared, and I resented her for everything she'd put us through. For every time Sarah asked about her and every time Ethan cried himself to sleep. Life became a balancing act, one where I had to keep my own pain hidden behind a mask of normalcy. I was the one who had to be strong, who had to keep the family from falling apart. There was no space for my own grief, no time to dwell on the past. I had to keep moving, even if each step felt like it was taking me further from the person I used to be. The days turned into weeks, and as winter edged into spring, I started to find a rhythm, something like normal. Without Emily, I was forced to adapt, building a new structure around Sarah and Ethan, one that relied on me and me alone. It wasn't perfect, and there were days when I felt like I was grasping at straws, barely keeping my head above water. But, little by little, I learned to manage. Our mornings took on a kind of synchronized chaos, like an orchestra that's slightly off-key but keeps playing anyway. Breakfast was cereal and fruit on weekdays, pancakes on Saturdays. Evenings were math homework at the kitchen table, cartoons on the weekends, and bedtime stories that sometimes turned into my own therapy. Tales where I invented new endings, ones where characters found their way back to what they lost. The kids adjusted faster than I did. They made friends at school, brought home macaroni crafts, and started soccer games in the yard. For them, life moved forward, and I think it surprised me how resilient they were, how quickly they adapted to our new world. But that was the gift of youth. They hadn't yet learned to carry the burdens of guilt or regret. They simply accepted things as they were. As for me, the sense of routine became my lifeline. I clung to it like a rope, the predictable rhythm of it keeping me from sinking. Work was busier than ever, and between that and the kids, my days were full, but there was a hollowness in those busy moments, an ache in the silences when the kids were at school, and the house was empty. That was when I felt it, the weight of her absence pressing down on me. But the routines, however flawed, gave me structure. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to keep me moving. Day by day, I realized, somewhere along the line, that I hadn't done anything for myself in years. It's funny how marriage and parenthood can blur the edges of who you are, like water slowly erasing the sharp lines of a drawing. I'd once loved hiking, but the trails and mountains had fallen to the wayside, replaced by playgrounds and grocery store aisles. One Saturday, I dropped the kids off at my parents' for the weekend. It was the first time in months that I had time to myself. With no one else to worry about, no one to care for except me, I dug out an old pair of hiking boots from the closet. The leather cracked and worn, a relic of the man I used to be. I drove up to the hills, unsure of what I was searching for, but knowing that I needed something beyond the four walls of our house. The trail was muddy and overgrown, and my legs ached with every step, but there was something liberating about being alone in nature, without the weight of fatherhood or the lingering shadow of Emily's absence. I felt the wind on my face, the dirt under my boots, and for the first time in months, I felt a hint of clarity, like a fog lifting. I spent hours out there, wandering aimlessly, taking in the sights and sounds I'd forgotten. By the time I made it back to the car, I was exhausted, my muscles sore, but there was a spark in me that hadn't been there before. It was a small thing, but it was something I'd done for myself, something I hadn't thought possible since Emily left. The days grew longer, and spring turned to summer. With each passing week, I felt myself growing more comfortable in the role of single parent. I found a kind of quiet pride in it, a satisfaction that surprised me. There were countless nights when I fell into bed, exhausted beyond belief, but it was a satisfying exhaustion, the kind that came from knowing I was doing the best I could for my kids. I became closer to Sarah and Ethan than I ever had been before. Without Emily, there was no buffer, no one else to rely on, and the three of us formed our own little unit. I learned the small details that I'd once overlooked, the way Sarah hummed to herself when she was nervous, or how Ethan's laughter could light up a room. One evening, after I'd tucked them in, Sarah called me back to her room. She looked up at me with those big eyes and asked, "Daddy, do you think Mommy's happy?" Her question caught me off guard, like a cold splash of water, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to tell her the truth, to share the weight of my resentment, my confusion, but I couldn't bring myself to put that on her shoulders. Instead, I told her something simple. "I think Mommy's trying to find what makes her happy." Sweetheart. It wasn't the full truth, but it was enough to satisfy her. And she nodded, accepting it. Moments like that reminded me of the responsibility I carried, not just to raise them, but to shield them, as best as I could, from the hurt that had settled like a scar across my own heart. Emily would still send the occasional text or email, filled with pictures of sunsets, her painted canvases, and long-winded descriptions of her journey. I knew, deep down, that she didn't expect me to respond. She was simply narrating her life for an audience. There was something detached about her words, like she was performing for someone else, proving that her decision to leave had been worth it. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd always assumed she'd come back, that eventually, she'd realize what she'd left behind. But the more time passed, the more I saw the emptiness in her messages. She'd found herself in all the places she'd gone, but she'd lost something too, the connection we once shared, the foundation we'd built together. She didn't seem to realize that with every update, every text, she was pulling further away, and I was learning how to stand without her. One night, as I sat alone in the dark, I came to a realization that was both painful and freeing. I didn't miss her anymore. Not in the way I used to. I missed the stability she once represented, the version of our life I'd always imagined. But the woman she had become, that person was a stranger. With this realization came a kind of quiet acceptance, a sense of closure I hadn't expected. I didn't need to keep waiting, didn't need to hold on to a future that was no longer possible. Emily had made her choice, and it was time for me to make mine. For the first time since she'd left, I felt a glimmer of freedom, not the kind of freedom she'd sought in far-off places, but the freedom to let go, to release the anger, the sadness, the weight of everything she'd left behind. As I sat there, I knew that I was ready to move forward, to create a life that didn't center around her absence. There was a future waiting for me, a future that was mine to shape. And as I looked out the window at the quiet street, I felt a sense of peace, a calmness I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew that, whatever it was, I was strong enough to face it. The phone rang on an ordinary Wednesday evening, right after I'd tucked the kids into bed. I answered without checking the caller ID, not expecting anything beyond a quick chat with a friend or maybe a telemarketer. But it was her, Emily. Her voice was strangely soft, as if she were testing the waters. And I could hear the nervousness, a slight tremor she tried to mask. She wanted to come back, just like that. "I've learned so much," she said, her words tumbling over each other. "I've grown, and I finally understand what I was missing." She sounded breathless, almost desperate, like someone who'd finally reached the end of a long, exhausting journey. She spoke of how much she missed the kids. How her journey had made her realize that her true happiness was here. With us. I listened in silence, my mind too numb to form any coherent response. She kept talking, as if the silence was a permission, telling me how she was ready to come home, ready to rebuild what we had. And as I listened, I felt something harden inside me, a wall I hadn't even realized I'd built. Emily was so sure, so casually confident, that I'd kept everything waiting, that the life she'd abandoned was just frozen in time, ready to be resumed. She paused, waiting, as if expecting me to say something, maybe even a sigh of relief or some warm words of welcome. But none came. I managed a quiet, "I need to think about it," which felt insufficient, but it was all I could say. She sounded surprised but agreed, and we hung up with a promise to talk again soon. After the call, I sat there in the silence, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't fully name. There was anger, yes, but also a strange sense of emptiness. As if I'd been bracing for this moment without realizing it. I didn't feel the way I thought I would. And in that hollow space, I began to wonder if I'd already moved on. A week later, Emily arrived at the house, looking more like the woman I once knew, though with traces of that new self she'd discovered in her absence. She wore a dress I didn't recognize, something artsy and flowing, and she had a smile that seemed almost rehearsed, like she was playing a part in a movie. She went straight to the kids, arms wide open, expecting them to rush into her embrace. But they didn't. Sarah stood stiffly, her mouth pressed into a thin line, and Ethan clung to my leg, eyeing her with a mix of confusion and hesitation. It had been months since they'd seen her, months of questions and hurt, and while I'd tried to shield them, they'd felt the impact of her absence in ways only children could. Emily's face fell as she realized they weren't welcoming her with open arms. She tried to smile, tried to brush it off, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the texts. The carefree updates. The way she'd flaunted her freedom while we were here. Picking up the pieces, she tried to make small talk, as if to coax them into warmth. But it only made the distance more palpable. And in that moment, I could see it, the realization dawning on her that the life she'd left behind hadn't waited for her. That her absence had left wounds she couldn't heal with a smile and a hug. She looked at me, her expression pleading, but I met her gaze with a quiet calm, unwilling to offer the forgiveness she seemed to expect. After the kids went to bed, we sat down in the kitchen, a heavy silence hanging between us. She sipped her tea, glancing around the room as if she were trying to remember the life she'd left behind. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I hurt you," she said, looking down at her hands. "But I was lost. I thought I needed to find myself." I listened, allowing her to talk, to lay out her regrets, her apologies, her justifications. She spoke of feeling trapped, of wanting more than the routines of suburban life could give her. She tried to explain, but her words felt hollow, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince me. When she finished, I took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. "Emily," I began, my voice steady, "you left us. You made your choice. And while you were gone, we had to keep living. We had to pick up the pieces you left behind." She flinched, as if my words had stung. But I kept going, laying out every moment of struggle. Every time I'd had to comfort Sarah or explain to Ethan why their mother wasn't there. I told her about the nights I'd spent alone, wrestling with my own anger and guilt, trying to fill the void she'd left. "You walked away from this life," I said, my voice firmer than I'd expected. "And while you were finding yourself, we were here living, surviving, moving on." She looked away, her face pale, and for the first time, I saw a crack in her confidence. She'd come back expecting forgiveness, expecting to slide back into the life she'd abandoned, but she was beginning to see the reality the life she'd left wasn't hers to reclaim. The days that followed were awkward, strained, as she tried to reinsert herself into our lives. She spent time with the kids, tried to connect with them, but there was a distance between them that she couldn't bridge. They were polite, but there was a wariness in their eyes, a cautiousness that hadn't been there before, and I could see it weighing on her, could see her realization that this wasn't the homecoming she'd imagined. One evening, as we sat in the living room, I turned to her, feeling the words rise in my chest, words I'd been holding back. "I've changed, Emily," I said, my voice soft but resolute. "I've built a life here, a life that doesn't center around you anymore. I've learned to be happy without you." and I don't think I can go back. She looked at me, her eyes wide, as if she hadn't expected this, as if she'd thought I'd been waiting, like some steadfast figure frozen in time. I could see the hurt in her eyes, the realization that she'd lost something she couldn't regain, and for the first time, I felt a sense of peace, a release from the resentment, the pain. I didn't need her to understand. I didn't need her validation or her approval. I was free. In the days that followed, we agreed to co-parent amicably, to create a stable environment for Sarah and Ethan. But we both knew it was over, that whatever we'd once shared had been broken beyond repair. Emily stayed in town, close enough for the kids but distant enough for me to continue the life I'd built without her. It was strange, moving forward without the shadow of her absence hanging over me. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of clarity, a quiet contentment that didn't rely on anyone else. I'd found strength in the struggles, resilience in the loneliness, and as I looked ahead, I saw a future filled with possibilities I hadn't considered. Emily had been part of my life, a chapter filled with love, heartbreak, and lessons I hadn't expected. But that chapter was over, and I was ready to turn the page. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing with certainty: I was no longer defined by her choices or her absence. I was my own person, strong, whole, and ready for whatever life had to offer. There's a certain calm that settles in when you've made it through the storm. I hadn't realized how heavy the burden of Emily's absence and then her return had been until I finally let it go. And once I did, there was a kind of peace, a lightness in each day that felt like rediscovering something I'd lost long ago. The kids and I began to settle into our life together, a new normal that was no longer a temporary state but something solid and permanent. It was freeing in a way I hadn't anticipated. I no longer looked over my shoulder, waiting for something or someone to change things. This was our life, and it was mine to shape. Small changes made a big difference. I stopped rearranging the photos around the house, stopped wondering if I should leave certain things untouched for when Emily might be around. I began to make choices based on what felt right for us, for the life we were building without her. And with each small choice, I felt myself growing stronger, more grounded. One Saturday, I took the kids to a local fair, something we used to do as a family. For the first time, I felt fully present. We rode the Ferris wheel, laughed over sticky cotton candy, and watched Sarah bravely go down the biggest slide. By the end of the day, as we headed home, I realized I hadn't thought about the past once. All I saw was the future, the memories I could create with them, the joy I could provide. After Emily left, I'd pushed aside the idea of having dreams or goals that weren't rooted in survival. But now, as I settled into our life, I started allowing myself to imagine a future beyond just getting by. I dusted off the guitar I hadn't played in years, feeling a connection to the music I'd once loved but had left behind. Some nights, I'd sit on the porch after the kids were asleep, strumming chords, the notes drifting into the quiet night. There was something deeply fulfilling about it, a reminder of the parts of me I'd buried, the man I'd once been. I even began to think about projects I'd always wanted to try but never had time for: renovating the attic, learning woodworking, maybe even picking up writing again. Small dreams, perhaps, but they were mine. The kids noticed the changes too. Sarah would often watch me with curiosity as I played the guitar. And soon enough, she asked me to teach her. Those evenings became our special time, where we'd sit together, fumbling over chords and laughing at our mistakes. It was a simple thing, but it brought us closer, created a new bond I hadn't anticipated. With each passing day, I felt myself growing, not just as a father but as a person. And in those quiet moments, when the house was still and the world felt at peace, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. One afternoon, I got a call from an old friend. He hadn't heard from me since everything happened and wanted to catch up. We met for coffee, and as we talked, I found myself sharing pieces of my journey, the struggles and the growth, in a way I hadn't expected. He listened, nodding, and by the end, he looked at me with a kind of admiration that took me by surprise. "You know, I don't think I'd have made it through something like that," he said, his voice filled with genuine respect. "You're stronger than you realize." It was the first time someone had said that to me, the first time I'd heard those words without feeling the weight of expectation. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe them. All the days spent in the quiet struggle, all the nights wrestling with self-doubt and fear, it had shaped me in ways I hadn't even seen. I walked away from that coffee shop feeling different, more confident in who I'd become. I was no longer the man waiting for things to get better. I was the man who had faced the worst and come out stronger. And as I drove home, I realized that I liked who I'd become. Scars and all, summer turned into fall, and with each passing season, I found myself savoring life's simple pleasures. I'd wake up early on weekends, make pancakes with the kids, and take them to the farmer's market, letting them pick out their favorite fruits and vegetables. I found joy in the smell of freshly brewed coffee, in the laughter that echoed through the house, in the way the kids' faces lit up when I surprised them with a new recipe or a spontaneous trip to the park. These little moments became the foundation of our life, the small joys that built a larger happiness. I didn't need grand gestures or big plans to feel fulfilled. All I needed was right here, in the laughter and love we shared. Each day, I felt a deeper gratitude, a sense of peace that came from knowing I'd built something beautiful from the ashes of what was lost. It struck me, one evening, as I sat on the porch watching the kids play, that I was genuinely happy. Not the kind of happiness that's fleeting or forced, but the kind that's steady and deep, rooted in the love I'd found for myself and my family. And as I watched them chase fireflies in the twilight, I realized that this simple, imperfect life was more than enough. The months continued to pass, and as I looked back on the journey, I saw it with a new clarity. Emily's departure, painful as it had been, was the catalyst that pushed me to discover parts of myself I'd never known. I'd found strength in solitude, resilience in heartbreak, and a profound love for the life I was creating with my kids. And as much as I'd resented her choices, I knew now that they'd set me free in ways I hadn't imagined. One evening, as I walked through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I was no longer haunted by the past, no longer held back by resentment or regret. I was ready for whatever the future held, open to the possibilities, and content in the knowledge that I'd built a life I was proud of. In the end, I realized that happiness wasn't something you waited for or chased, it was something you created. Piece by piece, moment by moment, and as I looked ahead, I knew that whatever lay on the horizon, I was ready. I was no longer defined by what I'd lost but by what I'd gained: strength, resilience, and a love that had been there all along.